Lesson 7, the Conquest of Canaan. We have seen that there are many difficulties in laying out clearly the events of the Exodus and the conquest into Canaan. Only the beginning of the route of the Exodus can be determined with certainty. Most of the names seem to be in the northeast of the delta of Egypt, with Sela and the Red Sea the same general area. The identification of most of the stations on the journey have not been made. The conquest also has its problems. There were changes in the Middle East in the 12th century BC. In Mesopotamia, the Kassite dynasty of Babylonia was brought to an end by the Elamites, who then turned their attention to Assyria. Important trade routes were at stake, and a new dynasty was established at Isin, which lasted for 132 years. Assyria had dynastic troubles when Tukulti-Ninurta was murdered by one of his sons. Some of his sons ruled until a rival from another family, supported by Babylon, gained the throne. Ashur-dan fought against the Elamites and exported some of the inhabitants. Tiglath-Pileser was the most important ruler in the late 12th century BC, and he turned his attention to North Syria. Now we come to the Aegean region. Most of the great centers of this period were destroyed about the same time, in the last 20 years or so into the 12th century. There doesn't seem to be a change in the population. Life continued, but without the palace regimes and associated economic stability. This is the time of the judges. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Then we have the Dorians, who came from the north. They are entering southern Greece, and the Ionians migrated to the eastern Aegean. These events represent historical realities, even though the traditions are late. In Anatolia, the Hittite New Empire was brought to an end by the violent destruction of Hattusis. The decline of agricultural production was threatening Hittite society and economy. The Hittites fought 3 naval engagements and a land battle with Elashia. Elashia was an ally of the Hittites and of Ugarit. And then in Egypt, Sennacherib prepared the way for his son Ramesses III, who was the last of the great warrior pharaohs. He was in control of various centers in Canaan: Beit Shan, Lachish, and Megiddo. All these were destroyed violently later. During the reign of Merneptah, Egypt had been threatened by an invasion from the west by the Libyans, supported by people from the countries of the sea. Ramesses made his regular preparations. They fought at Daji on the border of Amuru. Ramesses also defended the Nile and south of the Nile from an attack. 5 enemy ships are attacked by 4 Egyptian ships and archers on the shore. The papyrus Harris also records a campaign against the Shasu. We don't know where this was fought, but the scribes may have wanted to show the 3 great wars of Ramesses III. In the southern Levant, a radical change took place in this area. Cities were destroyed. Perhaps this is evidence of the arrival of a new ethnic entity. The newcomers had brought their potters with them. Who was it that destroyed these cities in the southern Levant? The coastal plain south of the main Lebanese port cities were subjugated to conquest and settlement from the last third of the 12th century BCE. The invaders brought unmistakable cultural features that had originated in the Aegean area, although they may very well have arrived by way of Cyprus. In the Cisjordanian highlands and Transjordan, the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE saw a new phenomenon in the hill country areas of the southern Levant. A huge number of small campsite settlements were established on the uplands of Upper Galilee, Lower Galilee, and the hill country of Manasseh. The Ephraim country of Judah and the biblical Negev also saw these settlements. New sites developed in the low-lying plains, the Sharon Plain and the Jezreel Valley. Only the biblical references are available to explain this phenomenon. These archaeological sites and their development is linked to the question of Israel's origins. These traditions now comprise a national epic edited and arranged by later writers. Rainey concludes, "Today, Transjordan and the eastern side of the Jordan Valley cannot be ignored as the most probable source for the new immigrants who established the small villages in the heights of Mount Ephraim, that is, the Sumerian hills." And the route of the Exodus. The Hebrews started on their journey from Ramesses in the Delta. They avoided the way of the Philistines, even though that was the most direct route. Several forts were along this road. They went first to Sukkot, then to Etham on the edge of the wilderness. Then they were told to turn back and camp at Pi Haharot between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon, near Daphne, a site supported by a Phoenician inscription found at Saqqara. The identification of Migdol is a question. The remaining stations are difficult. Finally, they came to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai seems to be in the southern Sinai Peninsula. They set out on an eastward journey to Transjordan. Spies sent to survey the land arrived at the desert of Zin. Then we have in Numbers 20 the death of Miriam. Then the refusal of Edom to allow passage through their country. Kadesh to Mount Hor, and at Mount Hor is the death of Aaron. Then they had the battle with Arad. Israel completely destroyed the inhabitants and their town, so that place was named Hormah. Tel Arad was settled in the 10th century after a gap of 2,000 years. The Canaanite Arad is probably Tel El Milk. Hormah is neighboring Tel El Meshech. Later, Arad again fell to the Yerachmeelites in 1 Samuel 27. Then the conquest, the campaign from the east. The Amorite kingdom of Heshbon was located between Moab and Ammon. Sihon, its ruler, conquered the entire plateau of Moab to the Arnon River. The Israelites traveled from Kadesh Barnea to Edom and Moab on the main road. Then they left Eim and journeyed to Dibon. After a couple more stops, they arrived at the Jordan opposite Jericho. They camped on the other side of the Arnon. Sihon refused them permission to travel through his land. He came out to fight and was destroyed. Og of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth and Edrei, was also deposed by the Israelites, and his land was confiscated. The conquest of central Cisjordan is the subject of the book of Joshua. The miracle stories of crossing the Jordan and the taking of Jericho are well known and are likely to raise tempers when discussed by modern scholars. According to Rainey, examination of the topography in and around Et Tel has demonstrated that the details of the Joshua narrative fit amazingly well with the physical configuration of the site and the surrounding terrain. In the southern campaign, Rainey again points out, it is interesting to note that there are no conquest stories about the northern district of the Shephelah in Joshua 15:33-36. Apparently, the relationship between the Israelites and the Canaanite, Amorite dwellers in that district is reflected in the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 36. Joshua captured Makkedah and killed all the inhabitants. Next, Libnah was taken at Tel Bernat, then Lachish, Tel Ed Dewir, then Eglon, Tel Itun. All the people in these cities were killed, just as God commanded Joshua. Then in the central hill country, 3 different accounts are reflected in the book of Joshua. The original version gave the conquest of Hebron and Debir to the Kenizzites. The leader is Caleb. Then Caleb said, "Whoever attacks Kiryat Arba, that is Debir, I will give my daughter in marriage to him." Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, captured it. A second version associated Caleb with the tribe of Judah. Now Yahweh was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they were not able to drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had iron chariots. Then they, that is Judah, gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. And finally, the conquest of Hebron and Debir are attacked by the southern campaign of all Israel under the leadership of Joshua. Then Israel returned to Gilgal. The settlement in the land. We are told of the land that remains in Joshua 13:1-7, Judges 1:19-36, and Judges 3:1-6. And then the contrast is given in Joshua 11:16-20. The settlement in the mountains in Joshua 17:14-18. The forests were cleared, the cisterns were plastered, and they had use of iron tools. All of these were necessary for settlement in that area. The allotment to the tribes would take place in Joshua 14-19, and the cities of refuge in Joshua 20, and towns for the Levites in Joshua 21. You'll recall that the Levites were not to possess any territory themselves in the land of Canaan. They were to have cities, some of them, 6 of them, in the 2 sides of the Jordan were called cities of refuge. And then they had pasture land around their city, but that was all. In Joshua's farewell, the covenant is renewed at Shechem in Joshua 24. You notice that we can't say very much about the history of Israel, the biblical account, as it agrees with the archaeological account. But what we do seem to have is a history written at a later time. The nation needed to have a history, and so the book of Joshua was written as a part, and the book of Samuel will be written as a part of obtaining that history for the people, which was so needed by them.